I was 80 years old the first time I told the truth about who I actually was. Not a partial truth. Not the managed version I had been presenting for 6 decades. The actual truth. To a woman I had never met before. In a room I had refused to enter for 11 years. On a Tuesday in October, when I finally ran out of the energy required to keep lying, my daughter Claire had been asking me to go for 11 years. I had spent 11 years telling her I was fine. I was not fine. I was not fine for 11 years. I was not fine for 38 years before that either. I just finally stopped being able to say so convincingly. The therapist was a woman in her mid-50s. She had a notepad on her knee that she had not yet written anything on. She looked at me with the particular patience of someone who has learned to let silence do the work that questions cannot. Outside the window, a tree was doing what trees do in October, losing things without appearing to notice. She said, "What brings you here today, Harold?" I said. "My daughter has been asking me to come here for 11 years. I finally ran out of reasons not to." She wrote something on the notepad. Then she looked up and said, "What changed?" I said, "I am 80 years old. My heart is running at 38%, and I am tired. Not of living, of carrying the story I have been telling about why I am the way I am." She said, "What story is that?" I said. "That this is simply who I am. That I am not built for the kind of openness that the people who love me have been asking for. That it is my nature and not my choice, and therefore not something I can be expected to change." She wrote something else. Then she said, "How long have you been telling that story?" I looked at the tree outside the window. 38 years, I said, give or take. She nodded. She said, "And how much of that time did you know it was a story?" I did not answer immediately, because the honest answer was all of it. I had known all of it, and I had waited 38 years anyway. My name is Harold Voss. I am 84 years old. My heart is running at 38%, and I want to talk to you about the 38 years. Not the 2 years at the end, not the resolution, not the lesson wrapped in a bow that tells you change is possible and it is never too late. The 38 years. Because I think the 38 years is where most of you are living right now. And I think nobody talks honestly enough about what it actually feels like to be inside them. Before I go any further, I need to ask you something. Is there something in your life right now that you have known needed changing for more than 5 years? Not something minor, not a habit or a preference, something that matters. Something that has been costing you or the people around you something real for long enough that you have stopped fully seeing the cost because it has become the baseline. Write how long in the comments, just the number of years, not what it is, just how long you have known. I want to see how many of you are inside your own version of the 38 years, because I suspect it is most of you. And I think you deserve to hear from someone who finished his before he could tell you what the inside of it actually looks like. The thing I needed to fix was the distance. I have talked around it in other videos. The managed surface, the glass layer. The man who was present in every room and genuinely unreachable in all of them. The specific and practiced emotional unavailability that I had constructed so completely over so many years that by the time I was in my 40s, I could not have told you where the construction ended and the actual person began. I had become the performance, and the performance did not know how to stop. Margaret told me about the distance in 1987, 11 years in, standing at the counter with her back to me. She said, "Harold, I feel lonely with you," I said. "I am right here." She turned back to the kettle. She told me again in 92. Different words, same sentence. She told me again in 98. 11 years, she said that time. 11 years of being lonely inside a marriage to a man who was right there and entirely unreachable. 3 times. 11 years between the first and the last. Each time I heard her, each time something in me registered it as true, each time I did something that looked like a response. A long weekend, more deliberate dinners, an attempt at the kind of conversation that felt genuine for 3 days and then slowly returned to the managed version because the managed version was what I knew how to sustain. And then the distance reasserted itself, and we went back to living parallel lives in the same house, and nothing actually changed. Here is the first specific thing I want to tell you about the 38 years. The attempts do not count. I do not mean that cruelly. I do not mean that effort is worthless or that trying is the same as not trying. I mean that in the specific context of a pattern that is this deep and this old, the attempts that do not produce structural change are not progress. They are pressure release. Every time I made a genuine attempt in response to something Margaret said, the attempt reduced the pressure enough that the urgency went away. And when the urgency went away, the motivation to sustain the attempt went with it. So I would attempt for 3 days or 3 weeks or once for almost 3 months. And then the pressure would be low enough that I would stop, and the distance would return, and the cycle would begin again. I did that cycle approximately 15 times across 38 years. 15 attempts, 15 pressure releases, 15 returns to the baseline. That is not change. That is a very sophisticated way of staying exactly where you are while generating enough movement to convince yourself and the people around you that you are working on it. I want to give you a specific example because I think the abstract version of this lets too many men off the hook. In 2001, Margaret and I went away for a long weekend. Her idea, a small hotel in Vermont, 2 nights. She had planned it carefully, and I had agreed with the specific intention of being genuinely present for the entire weekend. Friday evening was good. Dinner, a walk, conversation that had some depth to it. I went to bed that night feeling like a man who had turned a corner. Saturday morning I was on my phone by 7:30, not for an emergency, just the pull of it. The familiar gravitational field of work and obligation that I had spent 30 years letting define my attention. By Saturday afternoon, Margaret was quiet in the specific way that meant something had shifted. We drove home Sunday morning mostly in silence. I told myself the weekend had been good. Mostly good. A step in the right direction. It was not a step in the right direction. It was attempt number 11 of 15. And it produced exactly as much lasting change as the previous 10, which was none. Here is the second specific thing I want to tell you about the 38 years. The cost compounds silently. You do not feel it accumulating. That is what makes it so dangerous. If the cost of not changing arrived all at once the way a physical injury arrives, you would have no choice but to respond to it. The severity would demand a response, but the cost of an unaddressed pattern does not arrive all at once. It arrives in increments so small they are individually invisible. A conversation that Margaret stopped trying to have sometime around 2001. A question Claire stopped asking around 2004. A particular kind of look from David that I only recognized in retrospect as the look of a son who has accepted something about his father that he wished he did not have to accept. A version of Margaret that I glimpsed occasionally in the early years. The fully open version. The one who had not yet learned to protect herself from the distance. That I stopped seeing sometime in the 90s without noticing the moment it disappeared. Each of those things happened slowly. Each of them was individually unregisterable. Each of them was the cost of another month inside the 38 years. Together, they were everything. And I did not see them together until they were already gone. Here is my second question for today. What has the thing you have been not changing already cost you? Not what it might cost, not what you are afraid it will cost if it continues. What it has already cost. The conversations that stopped happening. The questions that stopped being asked. The version of someone you love that you have not seen in years because they learned to protect themselves from whatever it is you have not changed. Write one thing in the comments. Just one. The thing that is already gone. Because I think most men do not do this accounting. They think about the future cost. They do not add up the cost that is already paid. And the cost that is already paid is the most honest measure of what the next year of not changing is actually going to cost. Here is the third specific thing I want to tell you about the 38 years. The longer you are inside them, the more legitimate they feel. This is the part that I think is least understood and most important. At year 3 of not changing something you know needs changing, you feel like a man with a problem. At year 10, you feel like a man with a characteristic. At year 20, you feel like a man with a nature. And nature feels unchosen. Nature feels fixed. Nature feels like something you were given rather than something you built, which means it also feels like something you cannot be held fully responsible for and cannot be expected to fundamentally alter. I spent years telling myself I was simply not built for the kind of emotional openness that Margaret needed. Not that I had not yet learned it. Not that I was afraid of it. Not that I had built a very effective system for avoiding it and had been running that system for so long that I had confused the system with the self, that I was simply not built for it. That is what 38 years does to a pattern you have not changed. It becomes your nature. And your nature, everyone agrees, is not something you should be expected to change. Except it is not your nature. It is your history. And history, unlike nature, is something you actually built, which means it is something you can actually unbuild. If you are willing to stop calling it nature. I stopped calling it nature at 80 years old. In that chair in Claire's therapist's office on a Tuesday in October. Not a revelation. Not a dramatic moment of clarity. Just an 80-year-old man finally running out of the energy required to maintain the story that this was simply who he was. The story takes energy, more than you realize when you are young enough to sustain it easily. By 80, I was tired, and in the tiredness, I finally let the story down. And what I found underneath it was not the broken and insufficient person I had been so carefully protecting the world from seeing. Just Harold. Frightened Harold. Uncertain Harold. The Harold who had not known how to be reached and had spent 60 years pretending that was a choice rather than a limitation. He was not frightening. He was just late. 2 years. That is what I got with the real Harold showing up in the world. 2 years of Margaret knowing something closer to the actual person. 2 years of conversations that did not have the glass layer. 2 years of Claire looking at me the way she had not looked at me since she was small enough to believe her father had all the answers. 2 years out of 40. I am not going to tell you it was enough. It was not enough. But it was real. And the realness of 2 years was worth more than the managed performance of the 38 that came before it. Because in those 2 years, Margaret knew Harold. Not the version of Harold I had decided was safe to show, the actual one. And she chose him anyway, after everything. After 38 years of choosing the performance, she got 2 years of the person and she chose him anyway. That is the thing I carry into every morning when I sit in my chair by the window and the light comes through and the house is quiet and I think about all of it. She chose him anyway. I do not know how many years you have left. Neither do you. But I know this. The years you spend inside your version of the 38 are not neutral. They are not a pause. They are a cost that is being paid right now by people who did not choose the problem and cannot fix it themselves. And the years on the other side of whatever you have been not changing are available to you right now. Not someday. Right now. The therapist's chair, the conversation, the admission. The first sentence of whatever it is you have been not saying for however many years you wrote in the comments. It is available today. And I am 84 years old, and I am telling you that from the other side of 38 years of waiting. Today is not too late. but today is also not going to be here tomorrow. Leave me a comment. Write the number of years. Just the number. I read every single one. And if someone you know is inside their own version of the 38 years right now, send this to him. Without a note. Just send it. I am not done yet.